Abolishing slavery was once insane. It was once an insane idea. I am not joking, right? Enslaved people in the American South were like electricity, right? That is how integral they were to the operation of society at the time, right? And so getting rid of that system seemed impossible, and yet it was done imperfectly, haphazardly, it was sabotaged, but it was done.
So I'm really delighted to co-host this event with Sergio tonight and to welcome you all. This is the first in the 2022-23 season of the Front Lines of Democracy, and we're really delighted to kick off with Debra Thompson. I'd also like to thank the Toronto chapter of the Canadian International Council for co-sponsoring this event. It's a great privilege to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Debra Thompson, and the subject of her talk, The Politics of Race, and how it reveals, shapes, and disfigures the practices of democracy in Canada and the United States. The US, as we know, often claims to be exceptional, the oldest representative democracy in the world. Yet slavery was foundational to its origins in the establishment of the Republic. Legalized racial domination persisted for a century after the Civil War. Despite historic victories of the civil rights movements and many later advances, systemic racism and institutionalized discrimination continue to structure its civic life. Historically, Canada offered many Black Americans a refuge from slavery. Our self-image as a successful multicultural society is a form of exceptionalism too, however. It conceals deep racial inequalities and patterns of discrimination that shape our democracy in less visible ways. So what can we learn by comparing these two democracies? And how do we expand genuine freedom and political belonging in the face of their historical legacies and contemporary realities? Our guest this evening has spent her personal and professional life confronting these questions. Dr. Thompson is an associate professor of political science and a Canada Research Chair in racial inequality in democratic societies at McGill. She began her studies at Carleton, where she earned a BA in public policy, and an MA from the Department of Law, before moving to the University of Toronto, where she received her PhD in political science, and it's really terrific to see so many faculty from the university here. Following a postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard, she moved westward across the US from Cambridge, Massachusetts, to hold a series of faculty positions at Ohio University, Northwestern, and Chicago, and finally the University of Oregon, before returning to Canada to join McGill. Her first book, The Schematic State, Race, Transnationalism, and the Politics of the Census, published by Cambridge University Press in 2016, explored the political development of the national census in the US, Canada, and Great Britain. It revealed how the nature of the census changed over time, from being an instrument to manage and control racialized populations to making them legible, turning the inherently fluid and politically contested nature of race into a stable category to be used in law and policy. The Schematic State won major awards from the APSA, the American Political Science Association, the Best Book in Race and Politics, Ethnic Politics in 2017, the Seymour Lipset Prize for the Best Book in Canadian Politics in 2018, and an honorable mention for the Best Book in the field of international politics and history. And I can't remember a book that won these three prizes, the range, spectrum of issues. So it's really quite a remarkable feat. Professor Thompson's work has been published in leading academic journals as well that demonstrate the breadth and significance of her work and her scholarship, from the studies in American political development to the Canadian Journal of Political Science to social philosophy and policy, just to name a few. She serves on the editorial board of major journals, including some that I've just mentioned, but she's also a regular contributor to major newspapers and media outlets in Canada and the United States. And that's where I first discovered her work, reading incredibly important and revealing and insightful op-eds in the Globe and Mail since I moved back to Canada. The subject of her talk this evening is her newest work, The Long Road Home, on Blackness and Belonging. Already a bestseller and a finalist for the Hillary Weston Writers Trust Prize for Nonfiction, The Long Road Home is a remarkable book, vividly and skillfully integrating personal memoir and historical analysis to illuminate how race works in Canada and the United States. In doing so, she raises uncomfortable questions and reveals searing insights into both democracies. And I would like to add, especially our own, given the critical attention we normally cast upon our larger neighbor to the south. Debra is going to speak for about 35 minutes. I'll then begin a conversation with her, and then we'll open it up to all of you. So please join me in welcoming Debra Thompson.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you for those of you who don't know me, and thank you for those of you who do. Just to be clear, I have stacked the audience with my former professors and former students, so your job is to laugh at my jokes. And thank you, of course, to the organizers, Sanjay and Sergio. It's just really a pleasure to be here. So let's begin. Once upon a time, a few mistakes ago, I was living in a faraway land called Oregon. It is both this breathtakingly beautiful place, and it's also uniquely unforgiving in many ways. If you cross the state from east to west, it's like transversing these invisible thresholds that separate one alien world from the next, and the seething ideological divisions in the state mimic these discordant environments. So it was January 2020. We had never heard of anything like COVID or a global pandemic. We had no idea what was about to hit us a few months later. And like many Americans, I was appalled at all the things the Trump administration was doing, especially the way it had stretched the rules of what we consider to be normal in democratic life. And like many Black Americans, I was also wholly unsurprised by the emboldened white supremacy of many Trump supporters. And at the time, I was certain that Trump would win a second term in office. So by that point, I had already actually decided to leave the US, where I had lived for over 10 years, to return to Canada, and someone from the University of Oregon's Museum of Culture and Nature or something reached out. The museum used this monthly pub talk, not unlike this, to raise money. And the program administrator asked if I would be willing to present my research. I said that my new work on Black Lives Matter was not ready yet because I had had 2 small children and 10 weeks of unpaid parental leave. And so I told them that I don't have any new research, but I'm moving back to Canada and I have a lot of feelings about it. Can I talk about that? And she said, sure. So the title of that presentation, this is very meta, by the way. The title of that presentation was like, Return Some Probably Incoherent Ideas About Race, Democracy, and the Boundaries of Belonging. And that presentation became this article, which was published in the Globe and Mail on June 6, 2020, just as the kinetic uprisings that were sparked by the murder of George Floyd by the Minneapolis Police Department spread like wildfire across the continent. And that article became the basis for this book many, many iterations later, because as many of you know, writing is a messy process, and you learn as you write, and sometimes, like Neil Gaiman's character, Dream of the Endless says, the price of getting what you want is getting what once you wanted. So the book, the article, and that very first presentation all begin with something my father said in those early days of 2020 as I was talking to him about the Trump administration or something. He said to me, you know, Debra, your daughter was the first Thompson born in America since Cornelius Thompson escaped slavery. It's been over 150 years, and some days I think we came back too soon. And those words just struck me. I couldn't stop thinking about them. So, some backstory. My dad was born and spent most of his childhood in Shrewsbury, Ontario. It's a tiny town about 50 miles east of Detroit on the shores of Lake Erie. It and other neighboring towns like Buxton and Dresden were the last stops on the Underground Railroad. So in 1850, the US Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act as part of the series of larger political compromises made between the southern enslaving states and the northern free states. The act required officials to arrest people who were suspected of being runaway slaves based on little or no evidence, and they penalized any official who dared to not comply. Anyone found aiding a runaway slave by providing food or shelter was liable to 6 months in prison and a $1,000 fine. Monetary awards were offered to anyone who captured a fugitive slave. Those who were suspected of being runaway slaves could not defend themselves against the accusation, nor could they testify in trials. So the result was this program of national kidnapping of free Blacks across the United States. But the Fugitive Slave Act didn't extend to Canada, and so it was to Canada that thousands fled, including my grandfather's grandfather, Cornelius Thompson. Now, most of the people who escaped to Canada actually went back to the US at the end of the Civil War to find the loved ones that they left behind, lost somewhere along the way, or who were stolen from them. But generations of those people who were descended from these Black refugees from slavery still live in southwestern Ontario, including my dad's family. Because the communities were rural and segregated, my kin have the most incredible way of speaking. My father says theater, and he pronounces the WH in white. He talks in the same kind of rhythms and metaphors and riddles that characterize barbershop talk in African-American communities and cultures. He says things like, you know, Deborah, those politicians, they ain't got nothing but a nodding acquaintance with the truth. But he's also very Canadian. He's proudly, fiercely Canadian, and his accent appears plainly in words like a boat and sorry. So Dad doesn't know where Cornelius escaped from. He thought he heard our cousins talking about West Virginia or Alabama once, but he's skeptical. Deborah, he says, you're looking for ghosts. You're looking for evidence left behind by people who were trying to hide and whose lives depended on how well and for how long they could do it. So many of our stories are ghost stories. How could they not be? African-descended people in the Americas are connected by the horrors of the Middle Passage. It's that point during the triangular route of the transatlantic slave trade when Africans were violently kidnapped from their traditional territories, commodified as objects, forcibly transported to the New World, and sold as property. So too, the Atlantic Ocean holds a place in our collective memory. It is the goddess Yamaya's domain. There's blood in the water. It's the fathoms of the dead. So when I decided to move to the US over a decade ago, I thought the ghosts of my ancestors would welcome me home. I felt like I was returning to the land of my ancestors' birth, the country they built, where they prayed and sweated and toiled and were tortured and resisted and fought and wept as their children were stolen and sold, and were traumatized as they were raped for profit and murdered for sport. They escaped, and I returned to lay claim to the humanity that they were denied. I felt like I was going home. And I was wrong, as I am about so many things, but not in the way that you might think. So what I want to share with you this evening are some of these invisible and maybe even ghostly matters that materialize in this story of coming back, both too late and too soon, and the construction of these moments and places that shape all of our identities. I want to tell you the story of what it was like to have been in the US and the land of my ancestors, a country that both was and wasn't mine, to be doubly unwanted as both an immigrant and a Black person, but there by choice and protected by incredible class privilege. But then to leave, to return to this country, which I also love, even as I think most forms of nationalism are highly problematic. I want to acknowledge the unrepentant structural racism of America while not negating the subversive, insidious racism of Canada, to relay my bewilderment and my awe at Black people's love and hope for America, their pride in that country, their dedication to making it better, even as it has for more than 400 years refused to love us back. More than anything, I want to share what it means to be in a place, to have ancestral ties to a place, to be haunted by the ghosts who are tethered to the land and water and soil and swamp, but to be not of that place. These are the questions that I have asked myself. These are the questions that I asked that audience during the first presentation in Oregon so many years ago, just as I ask of myself and of you now, in the hope that we can collectively think through what it means to lay claim to a country, to believe in freedom dreams, to seek to belong, and to fight for change, even if that change means that we must abolish and start again. So, let's begin. As Sanjay said, Americans often think of their country as exceptional. It is one of the world's oldest democracies, the birthplace of revolutionary freedom, the only remaining superpower, the last line of defense in a world too commonly threatened by dictators and demagogues. Most famously articulated by the French diplomat Alexis de Tocqueville, the concept of American exceptionalism suggests that the tenacity of American democratic ideals is extraordinary, unusual, or unparalleled. There's something dramatic, or maybe it's just dramatically individualistic, about the primacy of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To me, it always seems so much more daring than Canada's motto of peace, order, and good governance. It's very boring, actually. But the doctrine of American exceptionalism requires this willful ignorance about how American democracy has worked for those who were excluded from the original 18th century formulation of we the people. The self-evident truth of the liberal ideal that all men are created equal was scarred into the Declaration of Independence at the same time that nearly 20% of the population was held in bondage. From the vantage point of African Americans who live in what W.E.B. Du Bois calls the Black life world, the U.S. isn't exceptionally free or equal. American racism is all the more tragic, all the more cunning, all the more ruinous, precisely because it exists alongside, but in direct contradiction with, the idealism of the American creed, the pervasiveness of the American dream, and the homogenizing power of American national identity. And to those of us who observe American history in the making from abroad, the United States is only exceptional in terms of how utterly, unforgivingly racist it is. So this idea of American racial exceptionalism is particularly powerful here in Canada. American racism is understood as real and as morally repulsive, and in comparative terms, Canadians think that racism here either does not exist, or if it does, it's perceived as being less harmful, less depraved, less entrenched than the racism in the United States. Now, there's a few reasons why Canadians think this way, but the most relevant, I think, is that America and its foundational beliefs, ideas, identities, narratives, obsessions, and psychoses have influenced the formation of Canadian national identity. Throughout history, we, at least in Anglophone Canada, have struggled to formulate our own national identity. It's hard to share a border language, popular culture, and media with the world's only superpower. So for Canadians, the United States is kind of like the mean girl in high school. The United States is our very own Regina George. We hate her, and we love her, and we think she's terrible, but sometimes she's not terrible to us, but she's frequently terrible to other people, but really, why won't she just pay attention to us? It hurts our feelings that she doesn't think we're cool. And so because there are a lot of cultural similarities between Canada and the US, being Canadian is defined, at least in part, by being not American. And this has ramifications for the way the country understands itself in racial terms. The logic is something like this. Racism exists in the United States. Canada is not America, ergo, there is no racism in Canada. Comparison is frequently, faithfully used in the service of Canadian deniability. It's our national pastime, an obsession that works to simultaneously hide and entrench the racial inequalities that define nearly every socioeconomic indicator in this country right now. And yet the cognitive dissonance required to be righteously indignant about anti-Black racism in the United States, but defensive when the perpetrators are the us and not the them, is itself a peculiarly Canadian form of racism. This denial is aided and abetted by the way that Canadian multiculturalism has become a powerful national ethos. No matter how multicultural we become, there's one question that non-white people get asked on the regular. Where are you from? No. Where are you really from? All the non-white people are nodding right now. For those of you whose presence has perhaps never been questioned in this country, it might be hard to see or hear the presumption, the insinuation in the premise of the question. Where are you really from? Because I can see you're not one of us. Where are you really from? Because you don't seem to fit in here. Where are you really from? Because I will stop you on the street and demand you answer my question because I am white and you are not, and deep down I believe that you owe me your time, your benevolence, your respect, your attention. Where are you really from? Because my curiosity is more important than your comfort or your safety. Where are you really from? Because how long you've been here will tell me something about your place in this country. Where are you really from? Because you can't possibly be from here. For years, Black Canadian scholars have explored the absented presence of Blackness in Canada. The absented part describes the way that Black people in Canada are assumed not to exist, or if they exist, to be recent arrivals to what has always been a majority white country. Catherine McKittrick writes that Blackness in Canada is always unexpected, always surprising. Blackness is surprising, she writes, because it should not be here, was not here before, was always here, is only momentarily here, was always over there, beyond Canada, for example. This means then that Black people in Canada are also presumed surprises because they are both not here and here simultaneously. So read this way, the question, where are you really from, is an attempt to address the shock and the astonishment of seeing Black people in a place where we are not supposed to be. But Blackness in Canada isn't just absent, it's absented. To be absented implicates the involvement of political processes that bring conditions into being. Our invisibility in national mythologies is neither a coincidence nor a mistake, but rather a purposeful crafting of a vision of the Canadian nation that renders Black people invisible. Now, the presence part of absented presence implicates the ways that narratives of Canadian identity depend on the existence of Black Canada even as they erase it. The idea of Canada as the promised land, the destination for fugitive slaves who followed the North Star, a safe haven from the tyranny of American racism, a contemporary multicultural paradise. These are fundamental, foundational parables of the Canadian imagination, and they depend on the existence of a historical, allegorical Black Canada, but just not too many Black people. And certainly not angry Black people, or radical Black people, or loud Black people, or ungrateful Black people, or Black people who remember the razing of Africville in Halifax, or Hogan's Alley in Vancouver, or Black people who point out the ways that Canada tolerates Blackness only begrudgingly. This is part of the reason why a sense of real belonging was always so elusive for me here in Canada. And so the kind of belonging I always wanted in the country of my birth, I instead sought out in the country that enslaved my ancestors. Many immigrants experience a culture shock when they arrive to their new countries. It's a different climate, maybe a different language, different norms, different customs. Now, obviously, this wasn't necessarily a problem for me when I moved from Canada to the US, except I underestimated the power of the narcissism of minor differences. So this is a Freudian theory that communities with adjoining territories or close relationships are actually especially likely to engage in feuds and mutual ridicule because they are hypersensitive to the minute details that differentiate them. Now, there's some differences between Canada and the US that we could all name like immediately, right? Like ketchup chips, right? Celsius instead of Fahrenheit, which is nonsensical. Nobody understands Fahrenheit. Also, the way that every Canadian has said to an American friend, did you know that Ryan Reynolds is Canadian? Or that was filmed in Toronto, actually. There's Young. But it turned out that a lot of what I knew about America came straight out of American pop culture, and so I had a hard time discerning what was real and what wasn't. So it wasn't until I became integrated into American society that I learned a few things. For example, cheerleaders are real. They're real, seriously, they're real. They're everywhere. They're in high schools. It's incredible. Growing up in the 90s and being in my 20s and the early aughts, I thought New York City was just a white urban party scene, but people of color live there too. Who knew? Portlandia is surprisingly accurate. I lived in the US for 10 years. I lived in Boston, the birthplace of the American Revolution. I then moved to southeastern Ohio in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. I lived in Chicago, the great Black metropolis, and finally Oregon, the western frontier. I met amazing people. I taught amazing students, and it was actually an incredible experience. But there were still some parts about being a Canadian in the US that I could never quite wrap my head around. This is a bill for my children's birth, one side of which estimates that It cost $122,000 for those of you who can't see that. Before I had moved to the US, I had literally never heard the words pre-existing condition before. I didn't know what a copay was, and I could not for the life of me understand what a deductible meant in the context of healthcare and not car insurance. I got used to asking about whether or not there were guns in people's households before we let my daughter go to birthday parties. And when she started having active shooter drills in her preschool, we knew it was time to go. Americans really do believe in the American dream. They believe that society is, in fact, a meritocracy. And if you work hard, you can be anything. But they also implicitly believe the opposite is true. If you are poor, if you are destitute, if you are sick, if you are vulnerable, you must not have worked hard enough. One of the most consequential differences, though, I think, between Canada and the US is the nature and manifestation of structural racism. So we often think about people as being racist or not racist, or behaving in racist or not racist ways, slurs that are shouted on the street. And yeah, that happens here and there. But racism isn't just this function of individual attitudes. It can't be eradicated by changing hearts and minds. Racism is the social, legal, political, and economic distinctions that mark and maintain unequal access and entry points to privacy, protection, property, prosperity, and personhood. Racism has shaped every major social, economic, and political institution in the United States, every single one. From banking and real estate to the location of highways and grocery stores, from the funding of K-12 education through local taxes, the origins of the Second Amendment, and the lack of anything that comes close to universal health care. Racism has literally touched every facet of American society in ways that I didn't understand until I got there. But there's another side to this too. I was once doing a presentation not unlike this in Canada, and after I finished, an older couple came up to me and said, "Don't worry, we didn't think you were Black until you told us." And they meant it as a compliment, and it was very Canadian of them. There is, I think, an innate value to exploring Blackness, belonging, and the politics of race in Canada and the US, not just in contrast, but rather in relation to one another. Ideas and inspirations, people and profit, goods and grievances have crossed the border for centuries. Black freedom dreams as well have never been bound by borders. And while others compare racism in the US to South Africa, apartheid, or Nazi Germany, the insistence here in Canada that racism happened somewhere else or happened a long time ago requires this kind of national ignorance, what the poet Dion Brand calls a stupefying innocence that is worthy of careful examination. Extreme cases have a lot to tell us, but so too do unsuspecting ones, and Canadian peculiarities make for interesting politics. Black communities in Canada are both very old, predating Confederation by nearly a century, and very new, growing exponentially only in the mid to late 90s. The population is quite small at just 3.5% of the national population, but significant in cities like Toronto, Montreal, and Ottawa. We are the diaspora of the diaspora, so to speak. Both old and new Black communities are the product of global collusions and imperial collisions of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. But we, Black Canadians, have neither the cultural recognition of African Americans nor the sheer magnitude of the millions that comprise the Black populations of the Caribbean or South America. We also have a unique kind of racial consciousness here in Canada, the result of multiple formulations of Blackness that are crisscrossed with ethnicity, nationality, generational status, language, class, religion, and more, but which are also shaped by convergences, amalgamations, frictions, and translations with shifting contours of Canadian life and society. Organizing and creating solidarity, even within the Black community, can be challenging, but comes with the potential of recognizing multiple, overlapping, contradictory, authentic Black experiences. Blackness in Canada also exists within the crucible of Canadian exceptionalism. That is, Canada the exceptional, Canada the clearly not racist, Canada the good, Canada, the white savior, Canada, the successful multicultural experiment. The dismissiveness of racism is part of the appeal, because if we are the exception to the racial rule, then we have no need to examine our exceptionally Canadian racial rules. It's a distraction, of course, because Canadian racism is shaped not just by a global history that gives it a familiar force and feeling to places that are not Canada, but also by those specificities that make it Canadian born and bred, just like me. So it's an open question then how Canadian racism is shaped by Canadian democracy, Canadian political structures, Canadian liberalism, Canadian whiteness, Canadian politeness, Canadian public policy, Canadian political parties, Canadian political culture, Canadian popular culture, Canadian urban centers, Canadian regionalism, Canadian ruralism, Canadian media, Canadian peacekeeping, Canadian war making, Canadian bilingualism, Canadian settler colonialism, and the Canadian national inferiority complex. Moreover, structural racism in Canada doesn't necessarily manifest in the same way as structural racism in the US. Structural racism here is highly malleable. It is purposeful exclusion and predatory inclusion. It is invisibility and hypervisibility. It is operationalized by the differential effects of universal laws and policies, the informalities and discretion built into systems of power, hidden entry points, overemphasized exit ramps, and normalized patterns of behavior that are excused away because this is just the way things have always been done here. Systemic racism is state action that deliberately limits movements, the accumulation of wealth, or access to opportunities, and it is when governments choose not to act and instead let racist systems remain intact. It is selective interest, sustained indifference, and messages of personal choice that naturalize racial inequality as being a consequence of individual failings. It is government protection and benefits that are hard to access or withdrawn without reason, and it is the co-optation of radical demands in order to make them more palatable, marketable, and profitable. The truth is, we actually don't know a lot about the nuances of Canadian anti-Blackness precisely because it is hard to research that which is so consistently jettisoned into the realm of the unthinkable. I came back to Canada during a particular moment. Some called it a racial reckoning, hearkened by death, substantiated through struggle, and haunted by the conceptual space between what was imaginable and what was possible. We didn't know then, in June of 2020, what had come crashing into the public sphere, full of chaos and passion, fury and rapture, and later, predictably, dilution and co-optation. Even now, a few years removed from the uprisings in the summer of 2020, there isn't a coherent narrative that can explain why it was the world stopped to protest, to rage, to rebel, to grieve together. I started writing this book during that moment when the protests in Minneapolis and LA, New York and Toronto, Montreal and London seemed to be this seismic disruption with the potential to catalyze finally an acknowledgement that white supremacy was born and bred in the global sphere, an understanding that racism can manifest in the realm of ideas and can move across borders as easily as the wind, an appreciation that historical context and local circumstances still matter, but they are nevertheless inflected with lessons and lesions from elsewhere, a resurrection of the disruptive and fracturing, compounding and conflicting potential of diasporic solidarity. Reckoning might not be the right word for all that has happened between then and now. The idea of a reckoning is about honored promises, debts repaid, and a balance restored. To reckon can also be used to express dreams, just as readily as a reckoning also faces the past again and again, not unlike the way that a return involves coming back to the beginning of a journey. What is clear, I think, is that moment we were once in has now passed. The moment we are in now is much less clearly defined, much more indeterminate. We are in a time of speculation and flux, vulnerability and risk, incoherence and possibility. A politics without guarantees, as the cultural theorist Stuart Hall once put it. And so take heed, we might not like what emerges on the other side of this moment. Racial progress has always always been shadowed by disproportionate white backlash. And we are very clearly in that backlash now. It manifests as the attack on critical race theory, the death threats sent to Black journalists, the use of woke as a disparaging slur, the insistence that white professors have the academic freedom to use the N-word in their classrooms. It is the dilution that turned radical demands that we rethink justice into little more than DEI trainings. It is as much the benign neglect of the state as it is the collective shrug of Canadians everywhere about the predetermined failure or purposeful sabotage of so many of the initiatives we had hoped would change our workplaces, our education system, our social moorings, and our access to substantive democratic belonging. But nothing would have happened had Black people not taken to the streets. As the great orator and abolitionist Frederick Douglass once said, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. And at what is the beginning, not the middle, and definitely not the end of this most recent iteration of white backlash, the very least we can do is remember and try to make sense of all that was and all that still might be. So the truth be known, as those of you who know me can attest, using my experiences as an entry point into the broader inquiry of the politics of race, Blackness, and belonging makes me deeply uncomfortable. I hate that you all know my dog's name. It bothers me endlessly. But I want to emphasize that this is not a story about racism. We don't write only about racism and domination and despair and loss. Instead, as Dion Brand reminds us, we write about life, impossible, improbable life. We live together here in the impossible, and we can struggle towards other impossible things with other impossible people. No one is illegal. No one is illegal on stolen land. Give the land back. In Black studies, where I like to think that I live these days, storytelling is tradition, repetition is sacred, and writing is the process of turning bewilderment into awe. Black studies as vocation isn't just interdisciplinary, but is actually undisciplinary and anti-disciplinary in that we seek the knowledge through which we will achieve racial justice in this world, or we will remake the world so those that follow can. The truest thing, of course, about travel and movement, as anyone who's ever gone anywhere knows, is the way that people change as they move. Our identities are never fixed, they're never once and for all. And so the idea of a return to Canada or a return anywhere is the stuff of fairy tales, going back to a place where we once were but no longer are and yet desire to be. It's a futility of the highest order. You can never really go home again, not because home changes, but because you do. Thank you.
The impact of what you said was it was a condensation of the whole book, is the best way I could put it. So if you haven't had a chance to see the book, it teaches you so much about this country, which, having grown up here, but then left for a quarter century myself and become an American like you did, almost around the same time. It's kind of remarkable. Very similar stories about how we pass our exams in the US.
Did you study?
I did study.
I studied too.
You'd think a political science professor should be able to pass the test.
I know, but in the citizenship guide, it says that you are not supposed to expand on the answers. And so I needed to make sure that I knew what the guidebook said about the answers and not what the truth was.
Yeah. But so there's so many of you here, so I'm just going to try to open the conversation in a couple of different ways. So a lot of your talk just now talked about what distinguishes racism in the US and Canada in this really remarkable way. And as you put it today, in this evening, and in the book, so America is really struck by, or is defined by, a kind of unrepentant structural racism. And in Canada, you say we have a subversive, insidious racism. It's still patterns in very structural ways, and disparities and patterns of discrimination and so on. I was just wondering, one thought was, and you talk about multiculturalism as a way of concealing it. It reminded me of a book that actually a former colleague of mine at the New School wrote, Vicky Haddam, called In the Shadow of Race. And she talks about how the language and the politics of ethnicity in the United States emerged in the 20th century, again through the census, remarkably similar types of work that you both do, to conceal the deep structural injustices, the violence of race in the founding of America. Do you see, in that sense, I mean, you've talked about all these differences between Canada and the US, but in the way in which we use the language of ethnicity vis-a-vis race, in the way in which the language of ethnicity subsumes race, hides it, and therefore kind of draws a false equivalence to it. Is that something similar that happens in Canada through our own policies, our own theories of multiculturalism?
Yeah, I mean, I think so this is actually something that I talk about in my first book on the census, that Canada has a question on race in the census in the early 20th century, in the 19th century. In fact, the very first census of Canada, it wasn't of Canada, it was PEI or something in 1767, has a question on race. And very specifically uses racial language that after the Second World War becomes a language of ethnicity, right? And Canadian census takers very purposefully drop the language or abandon the language of race because of the Second World War and because of the Holocaust. And there are other kind of reasons why that happens, but the language of ethnicity comes into being in Canada at the same time that we are formulating many of our the social architecture of the country in the post-war era. And so I think there's some path dependency gets embedded in particular ways. We have to pay kind of close attention here to the fact that one of the major cleavages in Canadian society is, of course, the French-English divide. And that has worked to reify language and ethnicity in particular ways that doesn't happen in the US. And kind of most importantly, like, we call Canada a white settler society, and the thing I want to emphasize is, like, it's a white settler society by design, right? Like, Joe Cairns is here, right? Canada has this basically white-only immigration policy for most of the 20th century, right? And so we can look at Canada and say, like, oh, there are very few, Black people who lived in the country, during the early 20th century right up until the 1990s. Like, that's purposeful, right? Like, there's a clear historical record of Black Americans who are trying to escape lynch mobs, trying to come to Canada, and they are turned away at the border, right? And so part of the language that we use and these framings, the point is, like, this is by design, it's path dependent, right? We are dealing now still with the consequences of decisions that policymakers made in the early 20th century, and they made decisions to keep Canada white. Like, that's the truth of it.
So that's remarkable, because for those of us in our generation, because we lived in a multicultural era officially, we kind of read back into Canadian history. What your book really exposes is quite a different story. I mean, I was really struck by the book when you talk about that there were 200 years of slavery in Canada. Yeah. That many of the states in the North actually abolished slavery before British North America. That population was incredibly small, deliberately so, as you just said, for a very long time. And so some of it is an anachronism. We don't understand our earlier history because we read it through the present, or the last, Another big theme in the book, which you didn't talk about so much, you touched on, so I think it'd be great if you could share your thoughts on that, is there's a very deep tension, I found, productive, interesting, provocative tension in the book on questions of citizenship and belonging. Yeah. The title of our talk and title of your book. On the one hand, as you say, you find, having lived in the States and read and understood its history, you find it kind of bizarre, tragic, amazing that so many African Americans profess a deep love of the country, and a belief in its redemptive possibilities.
Yeah.
And it goes back to Frederick Douglass. It goes to Langston Hughes. You hear it resoundingly in the speeches of Barack Obama. Even in the 1619 Project, there's a claim that this is our country and that's our flag, right? And it's funny, when I lived in the States for 20 years, and I actually became an American as a Canadian, living there with 2 children born there and lived there for 20 years, I realized when it came a time to become American, and I don't have the experience, obviously, that you're describing, but I'd become something. I'd become that, and I could identify with it quite deeply, in a way. On the other hand, then there are other writers, like Ta-Nehisi Coates, perhaps to some extent a little bit less, and there are people who know Charles Mills much better than I do in this room, that would say, well, there's a racial contract. It might even be much deeper. And as Coates says, this American dream is a distraction. It's a delusion. It's dangerous to believe in it. Mm-hmm. And you come at some points in the book on one side of that ledger, and at other points in the book on another. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, how you think about both, why is that an ambiguous, well, you have the way I read it was there's an ambiguity towards citizenship, towards belonging, driven by sort of skepticism and a suspicion of nationalism. And yet, there's this long struggle in American society and Canadian society and most modern societies for recognition. So it's sort of two sides, right? On the one hand, you want to be invisible to the state, which can be very predatory. And on the other hand, you want to be recognized because the worst thing, as you even say in the book, if you're an undocumented immigrant, I mean, you're invisible to the state, and then you're really open to predation. So how do you?
I mean, I don't. I'm pretty happy living in the middle of contradiction. And so in the book, so I think the tension is this. So the tension is that, that desire to be included, I have real questions about it. And I have real questions about it for a couple of reasons. One is that, when I was first doing my research on the politics of race, there wasn't a lot that was written, some present company excluded. There wasn't a lot that was written, and so I was reading a lot of work of Indigenous scholars. That was kind of as close as I could get was to race, was reading the work of like John Burroughs, was one of my heroes at the time. And, Indigenous scholars kind of, to me, like the thing that I learned from them was like Canadian sovereignty is a facade. It really is. Like this country was founded on stolen land, and we have broken the promises of the historic treaties, right? And the way in which, like, for example, in jurisprudence in Aboriginal law, the Supreme Court tells us that we must always presume that the Crown intended to act honorably, even when it didn't. And I think that you can look back through the record and realize the Crown did not act honorably and never intended to. Like that's quite clear. And so, this introduction to democracy through Indigenous scholars gave me this real skepticism of democracy as a mechanism of emancipation, right? Democracy in the way it is now, right? There's an entire literature that began with W.E.B. Du Bois, in the early 20th century, through Angela Davis, through like Ruth Gilmore now, on what an abolition democracy might look like. That's something different. But democracy as we understand it now seemed to me to be, look, let me explain this in the way that I talk to my students. My tenure's up for debate at this point. So imagine that like you're at a party, or there's a party that you really, really want to go to. You and your friends have wanted to go to this party for like the entirety of your college years, and you finally get an invitation, and you dress up, and you do your hair and your makeup, and you go to this party, and it is amazing, and you get in the door, and you realize that they are drugging your friends. Is that the party you want to go to? Or do you want to leave and build something better? Do you want to start something different? right? And so to me, the question of citizenship is like, is democracy, like, can we fix it given the ways in which it is currently entrenched, or can we abolish and start something different? And I fall pretty clearly on the side of like, burn it down, just so we're clear. And the tension with that, as I think I write in the book, is like, yeah, I got American citizenship. And it was a struggle. I thought about it for a really long time. It was, it did not come easily. I was not kind of happy about my choice. But at the end of the day, the reason that I got it, there are a lot of reasons, but the primary reason was because of the intergenerational trauma of slavery that lives in my bones. And the way that it manifests for me as a Black parent of small children is that I need to go where they go. I need to be able to follow them anywhere. And they are American citizenships. And the fact that I did not have American citizenship scared me, right? I need to be put in the same cage as my children if the worst should happen. And that might seem like dramatic, but as we talked about earlier today, there were in fact children in cages during the Trump administration, right? And so like that was at the same time that I'm very, very skeptical of citizenship. I'm very skeptical of the promise of liberal democracy. At the same time, you know, citizenship is a tool and an instrument. And if it helps me keep my children safe, then I will get it.
You say that in the book. You talk about abolition, and the examples are about the prison, the police. Mm-hmm. Would you extend that to, and we talk about the necessity of reforming our mm-hmm. institutions of representation, of accountability, of participation. I'm going to use your language, you said to burn it all down. I mean, do you think that these institutions are capable of being transformed by us, or do you have to see them anew? I'm going to make a connection here, which might seem odd, but I think it's relevant. I sort of think about, my own work has been on India for so long. You think of the work of, and not just the thought, but the work of Bhimrao Ambedkar, the famous Dalit leader who was the principal writer of the Indian Constitution, who was from a former untouchable caste. And he, more than any other figure of the nationalist movement, of the post-colonial elite, believed in the redemptive possibilities of constitutional democracy to undo the vile inequalities of caste, of untouchability. That was one figure. I mean, there are others. We can look in other post-colonial, anti-colonial contexts too. Just give that as an example. Mm-hmm. And so there was a figure who thought, yes, as wretched as much of the society is, we can reform it through a constitutional democracy that has these promises. And of course, today in India, it's all being dismantled. But that's what he believed then, and I would like to think that for whatever advances a country like India made vis-a-vis caste, mm-hmm. it made because of its constitutional democratic regime. But I was wondering then how you think, so how far, is it specific institutions that absolutely must be reformed that we've seen in the movement of Black Lives? Mm-hmm. Or how far and how deep does it go?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So let me give kind of two answers. One, the first answer is that, you know, one of the next projects I want to work on is to think about the ways in which specifically I'm interested in Black folks, but I think many other folks, our interactions with the state, even those elements of the state that we frequently view to be, you know, in the service of justice or around social benefits, our interactions with the state are frequently coercive, right? And here I'm thinking like, obviously the police, right? Obviously the police are coercive, but I'm also thinking about like public health as coercive. And I think any women who have ever tried to get a doctor to believe you when you tell them what's wrong with you, I think maybe you have experienced something like that. So I'm thinking public health. I'm thinking about like a friend of mine who had a child last year. I saw him, and I was like, "Hey, you know, what's going on? How's the baby? You know, have you signed up for the daycare service in Quebec?" And he was like, "Deb, I still do not have a birth certificate for this child because the Quebec government cannot handle Nigerian surnames." And in case you were wondering about bureaucracy in Quebec, you cannot do anything without paperwork that proves you have other paperwork. It is so bureaucratic. And I think it's also bureaucratic in much of Canada. But like, I was thinking about how like that's an interaction with the state that like, that again, is like punitive, right? People are being punished for having names that do not conform with maybe Anglo, or in the case of Quebec, like Francophone conceptions of what appropriate surnames are. And I think that so much of our interactions with the state, again, our being Black folks, are in fact punitive or coercive. And so I don't, you know, I think that the police are uniquely coercive, obvious, and violent. And no, I don't think the police can be reformed. And no, I don't think prisons should exist, frankly. You know, like you know, there's at the height of the George Floyd rebellions, there was an article published by Mariam Kaba, who, you knew, at McGill when she was there in the 90s. And it's called, the title of the article is like, yes, we literally mean abolish the police. Like, we're not talking about defunding. We're not talking about detasking. We're talking about abolition. You know, and I know, and the second part of this answer is like, that sounds radical and maybe bonkers to some of you. And the thing I want to say to you is that abolishing slavery was once insane. It was once an insane idea. I am not joking, right? Enslaved people in the American South were like electricity. Right? That is how integral they were to the operation of society at the time, right? And so getting rid of that system seemed impossible, and yet it was done imperfectly, haphazardly, it was sabotaged, but it was done, right? And so when we think about these impossible dreams that we have to change the world, they are not, in fact, impossible because we have done impossible things before.